Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 484 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I'm starting a periodic series of interviews around my upcoming book. I've mentioned it a few times, but I'll be publishing the complete guide to low-fire glazes in 2024. And even though that's a year away, I've been working and writing on that now. Part of the process has been interviewing folks that are in the book and trying to understand what it is they do. So for today's interview, I'm talking with Alex Thullen, who is a ceramic materials engineer at Pewabic Pottery. He maintains their line of glazes, including iridescent lusters, which is the topic of today's conversation. In our interview, we talk about the mechanics of luster, how the timing of reduction affects those glazes, and how his work continues research that dates back to the early 1900s when Mary Chase Perry Stratton started the pottery in Detroit, Michigan. You can find out more at pewabic.org. You can also see examples of Alex's work if you follow him on Instagram. He also has a secondary account called Glaze is Just Glass Paint, and it features lots of images of lusters and other glazes that we talk about today. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. So first, can you just explain what you do at Pewabic?
Yes. So my job title is I'm a ceramic materials engineer, which means pretty much whatever you want it to. My main focus is glaze development, developing new glazes to introduce into our existing palette. It's troubleshooting issues for existing glazes that come along. It's development of new surfaces, which is driven by the product development process when it comes to kind of retail products that we're making, or custom surface development for clients that are coming to us for architectural or commemorative tile. So in some cases, we might have to reproduce a company's logo, and we don't necessarily have that, exact kind of Pantone color match in our palette. So in that case, we'll work with a client to develop something custom to really meet their expectations. So that's a big chunk of it. Another big part of it is, and it's become more prevalent in the last few years, is dealing with material consistency and supply chain issues, because, as everybody in our field knows, it's become difficult just with all the global supply chain problems. So, in the last year, at least 3 materials that we've been using as long as I've been around have gone extinct. And so, we've had to reformulate massive portions of our glaze palette to accommodate for that. And so kind of, in this post-2020 world that we're living in, that's just, for anybody operating on this scale and making as much work and going through as many materials as we are, it's just become a really necessary part of the process to invest in.
Yeah, give us an idea of how many, let's say tiles for the commercial part of the business, for the tile business. How many clients are you guys working with a year, if you had to guess?
Somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200 for custom work. And that can be anything from something as simple as like a small backsplash to a fireplace to, entire rooms. We do work on a corporate scale too. So we work with architects and interior designers and things like that. There's really no limit other than just our basic capacity to, the kind of scale of the job that we can take on.
Because I feel like with the material shortages, it seems like it'd be particularly hard if you're mid-project with someone and then all of a sudden something shifts and you only need, let's say you only need 100 more tiles, but the materials you need for that glaze have changed enough that you got to go back to the starting block. Does that happen very often?
Not typically in the middle of a project once it's gone to the floor and we're in the middle of production. Sometimes, and I mean, anyone who works with clients will understand sometimes the design process is extremely protracted. So in some cases, from that initial conversation with their team and their architects to when the job is actually delivered to them can be, 5 years sometimes. So it's pretty rare that we would have to scramble to deal with something like that while we're actually in production, because that production process generally doesn't take more than 2 or 3 months for a larger scale job, I would say. And we try to maintain as healthy a backstock of materials as possible, space allowing, so that we do have a little bit of a buffer if something like that happens.
So, in terms of the low fire versus high fire or mid range discussion, how much of your guys' glaze palette is in which category?
So I would say it's probably 98% high fire. Really, what we do that's low fire is our iridescent and luster glazes. Now, historically, that would have been flipped. Everything in the early days of the pottery, because we date back to 1903 originally. And everything back then, like everything everywhere back then, was all lead based. But the understanding and the availability of materials and material science is just not what it is today. So, you were dealing with things like lead, like uranium, things that, nobody in their right mind would touch today if they didn't have another option. So since the early 80s, which is when the current kind of iteration of the organization, the Pewabic Society, was formed, that's the nonprofit that runs it today, everything that we have produced, with the exception of the iridescent / luster glazes, has all been high fire. And so we've gone through a very long process of trying to replicate the look and the feel of those historic lead-based glazes using, materials that are available and safe to work with today.
Yeah, I mean, when you talk about uranium, like lead's bad enough, but I can't even imagine where. I mean, did they know the radioactive potential of that, or how did they deal with that?
They definitely did. I don't know to what extent, their safety protocols were working with it, but I've had conversations with our archivists looking back at historical documentation and records, and there are definitely indications where they say, we're switching to this different form of uranium because we know this to be less radioactive than this one that we've been using before. So they were definitely aware of it. There's no question about that.
God, whew. Yeah, that's a whole nother thing. That was a whole nother era.
Well, we have a lot of fun going through our collection with a Geiger counter and just seeing like what registers and to what degree.
Right. Well, when you think about those iridescent glazes, can you describe for the listener who can't see them at the moment, like what is the quality that makes them so different, like visually, than the other glazes?
I think it's important to differentiate between kind of different categories of things. So you hear people talk about iridescent glazes, luster glazes, opalescence and things like that. They're all different kind of visual effects that tend to get muddied up and mixed up. And so the term iridescent is really something that our founder, Mary Stratton, used to describe some of her glazes because they were more iridescent than lustrous. And so there's a sort of colloquial definition, and then there's kind of a technical definition. So everything that we do and what we're talking about fits within the technical definition of what are called luster glazes. And those are in-glaze lusters. So it's different from what you think of with like ancient Middle Eastern, painted luster surfaces that are applied, and they're different from resin lusters, which is what most contemporary artists think of when they think of lusters. They're thinking of, gold, platinum, copper, that sort of lusters that are applied. These are glazes where materials are introduced directly into the glaze and are fired in the glaze. And so all of the effect comes from the glaze itself. It's not a layering or coating that you put on top of it. So when you talk about this kind of thing, there's kind of a spectrum of results and kind of aesthetics that come out of it. So when you're talking about things that are more lustrous, you picture that kind of like copper penny look to it. Highly metallic, highly reflective. That falls more on kind of the luster end of that spectrum. When we talk about iridescent, we use that as a blanket term for everything that we're doing, because that's just sort of our lexicon. But there's a whole kind of universe of effects that go into there. So for me, when I'm talking about them, I use luster to describe things like the copper glaze that we do, which is highly metallic, highly lustrous. But then when you get into kind of quote unquote iridescent things, they have a lot more depth. They have a greater deal of transparency, and they're not as highly metallic, but they definitely still fall within this gamut of what are kind of scientifically known as dichroic effects. So the kind of definition of that is basically they change their appearance depending on lighting conditions and the angle that you're actually viewing them from. They can look like a completely different glaze depending on those things, how they're moved around. So in some cases, I actually don't like to photograph iridescent stuff because it doesn't give you that real sense of what it's doing. You almost need to see it in a space. You need to see a video of it. You need to see it, moving to really fully grasp kind of what's going on with that effect.
Yeah, and I think the popular culture equivalent to this is in the 90s. Do you remember the cars that were painted with iridescent paint?
Yeah.
And the car would look white, and then it would drive past and it would change to purple depending on where the angle you were. And for some reason in the late 90s, or at least in Virginia where I was, that was like a thing. Like people were really making their cars iridescent. But I was actually looking at the catalog for the different glaze colors, and it was interesting. The way you guys listed is that this is an iridescent blue or a blush or aurora, which is like a greenish color, but you put on there high variation, which I think lets the person know like this is what it looks like, but it's going to look different when we fire it, because every time we fire it, it looks a little bit different.
Yeah, there's a heavy disclaimer that comes along with those. So most of our glaze palette, we basically offer a range rating, so a client kind of understands what they're getting into, because some people want things that are incredibly consistent and static, and some people like this wild, crazy range of results they're going to get. So with most of our normal glazes, when we're giving out samples to client, we give out a single sample, and it just says, this is the range rating that you can expect. When we're showing people the iridescent glazes, we'll show them a board that's got 9 tiles on it. And we purposely, curate that to represent the widest possible range of results that a client could expect, because they may get 1 tile that's on that board, they may get every tile that's on their board, and they might get anything that's in between, but it's completely impossible to predict, because it's all based on the nuances of the firing. It's based on where they're placed in the kiln. Slight differences in heat, level of reduction can give you wildly different results within the same basic sort of glaze family of appearances.
Can you talk about the core constituents of a glaze like this?
So there's a lot of different ways that it has been approached historically. Obviously, we were talking about the history of our organization, that everything was lead based. Today, most of the people that are doing this kind of surface, at least at low temperature, are using a glaze that's composed almost entirely of fritz. There can be a little bit of clay that's added into it just to help stabilize and suspend it. And then you're working with some very basic materials that are kind of known to be the ones that give you these various effects. So the big 3 that you'll see people talk about all the time are copper, bismuth, and silver. So in terms of achieving your specific iridescent or luster effects, those are going to be the biggest ones that you add, but then you can still introduce the whole kind of, standard uh, tend to think of in glazes, things like, cobalt, chrome, copper, all the rest of it. And and then, there's also the potential of when you're doing this kind of work for layering them on top of other surfaces. We were talking about how the iridescents have a greater degree of transparency and depth, so you can strategically, like a lot of people do with crystalline glazes, they'll put them over top of colored slips to give you this wider range of effects than you could just get with the glaze itself.
Bismuth is not a colorant that you hear people talk that much about it. Can you?
No,
I actually don't even know that much about it. Can you talk about what it is?
bismuth is a very powerful flux. It's not used terribly frequently in that way. Most of the people that are using it for these kind of opalescent, iridescent effects. It's used a lot by crystalline people, and a lot of people don't hear about it because that community tends to be. I don't mean this to be disparaging, but there isn't as much kind of free trading in this sort of technology and information. That's changing. That's evolving a bit. But these are people that spend their entire careers, developing these effects, and that's their livelihood. So there's always some degree of that goes on. But in terms of conventional glazing that 99% of us are going to do, no, you're never going to touch stuff like bismuth or silver.
So one of the other elements that really makes this work is the reduction. So you usually in half hour glazes, half hour reduction, you would be having feldspars. It'd be kind of a more traditional lineup, but Fritz, because they're already pre-formulated glaze, and I guess it depends on which one it is, but for the most part, they're fully contained. They have alumina, they have silica, they have the core flux of whatever it is.
Yep.
But then when you're reducing them, is there any issues with? I've never reduced a Frit based glaze. Like, is there any issues with that are different than anything else?
Not really. I mean, like you said, Frits are just fully composed glasses. So they have all those constituent materials. They have your fluxes, they have your silica and alumina, and then most of them also contain boron, because a lot of them are intended to be glazes that are fired at lower temperatures. So even the original iridescent glazes that we made here at Pewabic, even though they were lead-based, they were made with a lead-based Fritz that the founder was creating. And that's because boron is really problematic in its pure form. So if you introduce it into a glaze, it tends to bond with any soluble sodium that's there, and it crystallizes back out in the form of borax crystals, which is a nightmare to deal with. So by fritting the entire glaze, you come up with something that is chemically a lot more stable and a lot less reactive. And so you have basically your fully composed glass that you can just add whatever colorants you want to and a little bit of clay to kind of suspend it, and you're good to go. That's your glaze. Now, depending on the specific makeup of the specific frit that you're using, there's a wide range of results and different kind of chemical mechanisms that they use to melt at those extreme low temperatures. And those can give you lots of different effects depending on the frit or the combination of frits that you're using.
So in the book, I'm writing about Fritz, like how Fritz are made, and it's interesting to think about that on a small scale, like that they were making their own Fritz. Because in my mind, these are like major industrial production, where you're dry mixing materials, firing them into a molten state, and then releasing that into a water bath or a pool of some sort, and then that dramatic sort of temperature reduction creates this kind of explosive powdering of that frit as it's coming down. Was that how they were doing it? Like how did it work back in the day?
I mean, back in the day, they were, like you said, they were melting everything in a crucible, and then they would be the real like old school way of producing them is they would be dripped slowly into water, and that would instantly kind of shock cool them, and so you'd end up with a bucket full of marbles, basically tiny little balls of glass, and then those would have to be milled down and broken back down into the powder.
I was recently talking with Matt Katz about this, and he sent me this great video of this Italian company, and it kind of just shows It's almost like a cartoonish drawing of it going through this whole process. And it just makes me think about energy expenditure, that like Fritz, as environmentally friendly as low fire can be, the thing that keeps it from being really environmentally friendly is that Fritz, there's a lot of energy that goes into making them before they ever get to your studio.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how to think about labeling low fire as environmentally friendly.
Well, I think you have to ask, is there anything about ceramics that you can label as environmentally friendly? I
Good
mean,
point.
that's a tough question that, doesn't get talked about a lot, but that you really do need to consider when you're making, decisions about how you're making and what your technique is that you're working with in your studio. I mean, this is, our materials are strip mines. This is not an eco-friendly process that we do. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Hi, I'm Kara, content creator and Facebook wrangler for Amico Brent, bringing you ideas and support for your creative adventures every day. This week's episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfeld Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of thousands of objects made by over 800 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfeldcollection.com. So as I'm looking behind you, I see all these containers of glaze that are very carefully labeled, as well as your dry materials that are carefully labeled. But when it comes to these iridescent things, if they have silver or bismuth, like all these things, there is a more toxicity risk than, say, iron, which for the most part is okay. Like you can go swimming in that stuff and it's fine. So how do you mitigate toxicity risk with something that has an unusual ingredient or something like silver that could, I believe that can be absorbed through your skin?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what form you're using it in and to what extent, how water soluble it is, because that definitely increases absorption and the ability of it to enter your system. But yeah, there's definitely an extra layer of precautions that are taken. I mean, we always use respirators when we're doing anything that's going to be, getting anything airborne or creating dust. With the iridescence, we take extra, levels of precautions. So we will wear gloves anytime we're handling anything like that. Basically, heavy duty nitrile is what we use. Because yeah, silver in particular, it will, the first thing you'll really notice about it is the discoloring effect. So it will dye your skin if you get it on it, like purple or little black flecks sometimes. And people think that it's burning into your skin, and it's actually the photosensitivity of the material. When you think about like how silver is used in photography, so as it's exposed to light, it turns black. So that's usually the first indication. If you get it on your skin, that's kind of what you'll notice. But yeah, we take some pretty extreme precautions when we're dealing with things like that, exactly for that reason, and take a lot of time really closely going over things like our SDS sheets that we get from the suppliers and the manufacturers, just to make sure that we are following, whatever safety guidelines they recommend for the handling of that material.
Are there any precautions that need to be taken during the firings of these, especially when you're reducing it? I would imagine there is some vapor in the kiln that's happening through that reduction process.
So there are different types. We don't really tend to think of this much because most of what we deal with is just dust. But any commercial respirator that you buy, there are different kinds of cartridges that you can use to protect yourself from various kinds of threats. So, when we're doing our firings, there's different kinds of hazards because there's an explosive quality to the actual firing and reduction process. And so, we'll wear protective fireproof suits. We'll use full face shields rather than just a typical respirator that just covers your nose and mouth. And then we use different types of cartridges. There's specific respirator cartridges that are intended for vapor rather than particulates. So that's the kind of thing that you need to kind of take into account.
And in terms of the firing process, it is not like a raku process where you're taking the object out of the kiln, right?
Essentially, you're doing it in reverse. And comparing it to raku isn't really that far off. People use things like silver and bismuth and raku glazes for various effects as well. What we're doing is a little bit higher temperature. It's, more in the kind of cone 04 range rather than raku, which is a little bit lower, but not terribly. But it's just a more stable and consistent process. There's still a high degree of variability, but like you said, it's not like when you're taking a piece out and you're introducing it into a combustible. We kind of reverse that process. So the wear is fired in the kiln, and then you introduce the combustible into the kiln rather than the other way around. And there's lots of different ways that you can do that, and people have done it over the years. So you can do that with oil drips. You can do it with wood. People will just, throw little tiny pieces of wood into the kiln to create that reduction. I think I read somewhere that Beatrice Wood used mothballs for hers, which I can't even imagine how noxious that would be to be around. And then there's just additional kind of fuels that you can use. I mean, historically, we don't do this anymore, but we used kerosene or motor oil, which is pretty vile. Today, we used vegetable oil, which is, obviously a lot safer, a lot healthier to be around. You still want to use the respirators and everything, but it's not nearly as hazardous, and it gets you virtually the same effects. It's really just anything that will burn, anything that will create a reduction atmosphere.
And this is in a gas kiln, or is this you do this in an electric kiln?
We do it in an electric kiln, but you can really do it anywhere you like. And there's different approaches to it. I mean, some people like to encompass it all in one process. So they will fire the wear, they'll cool it down to kind of the target temperature, and they'll do the reduction then. Some people, including like what I've seen in videos of what Greg Daly does, is he will just do his low firing of the glaze, and then he has a complete separate firing where he just brings it back up to that temperature where you have the kind of like molecular mobility and the ability for it. It's just hot enough that it can still be reduced. And then he'll do, several minutes or however long it takes to get the reduction effects, and then just crash cool it again. I don't think there's any particular right or wrong to that. I mean, you could argue that one is maybe more wasteful than the other, but it's just all about, what works for your process, the degree of control that you're going for, and what gets you the effects that you're looking for specifically.
Yeah, and there's a principle that I want to draw out of what you said, which is that reduction, if the glaze is in a molten state, there is, I think you described as molecular movement or availability. Mobility.
Not my term, so don't quote me on that. But yeah, it's the idea that the chemistry of the glaze isn't completely stabilized. It's still open to effects. Now, with something like a crystalline glaze, with crystallization, the glaze needs to still have some fluidity to do that. A lot of what we're talking about with luster glazes, they can be hardened off to a much greater degree to get those effects. And it's sort of analogous to what you see, again, to kind of go back to reference what a lot of people in the crystalline community do. There's this process called striking, which is basically the same thing, except it doesn't necessarily have to involve the application of combustion and reduction effects. It's just bringing it back up high enough that you're triggering it to the point where it becomes kind of chemically reactive again. And then you can get, interesting or unusual effects, but you're not completely remelting the glaze in order to do that.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, because if you did it really early and the glaze is not melted, nothing happens because
it passes right through it.
Exactly. Yep. But then if you do it really high I would imagine that it might burn out. Like there's something about reducing it at the right time so that the
Yes.
effect does not evaporate, so to speak.
And it's really interesting how many times you can kind of draw this comparison, but it's very much like crystalline glazes, where if you do your holds at specific temperatures, you're going to get specific kinds of crystals that form. There's a very similar effect with the reduction. It's not just the amount of reduction that you give it that determines the specific effect. It's what temperature do you do those at? That can affect not only the degree to which you get an iridescent or luster effect, but it can really affect what the actual color response is as well in some of those.
This sounds like a dumb question, but I noticed that almost all the iridescent glazes are glossy. Is that because the crystallization in a matte keeps this effect from happening, or can you make a matte glaze iridescent?
No, you can absolutely make a matte glaze iridescent. In fact, I mean, for me, some of the most extraordinary iridescent glazes are the matte ones because you don't have the glare factor of a glossy glaze diluting that effect effectively. And it's adding just an additional degree of kind of light refraction to the game. So it's not a better or worse situation. It's just kind of different, I guess is the way I would describe it. But no, those effects can absolutely be achieved in matte glazes. There is a question of kind of what do you mean when you're talking about mattes, which is, a distinction that you'll get into when you really get into glaze chemistry. But there's a difference between a matte glaze and a crystalline glaze that is so over crystallized that it looks matte. And there is a chemical distinction between those two things. So that's just something that you always kind of have to ask yourself when you're looking at an effect is sort of, what am I actually looking at here?
And I should have done some more ceramic history before I talked to you, because there was a company in the 1920s. Like when I think about Art Nouveau, it feels like there were some matte lusters and other lusters that were made at that time, which now when I'm thinking about it would have been in competition with early Pewabic, right? I mean, this would have been, because I cannot remember the name of the company that was known for doing this.
Yeah, I can't either. It's EOSIN. I don't know how it's pronounced, but that refers to the ware and not the company. But yeah, there were a lot of people around that time that were really starting to dig into it. So, I mean, there was Mary Stratton who started Pewabic, Louis Franchet, who's a French ceramicist, and a few other people around that were all really interested in it kind of around the same time. And, there's a connection to a lot of, Art Nouveau glass as well that has that effect in it. And it's all the same basic kind of mechanisms because, glaze is glass. There's really no distinction to it. So the basic scientific principles kind of carry over throughout.
And I'm thinking about the Metropolitan Museum for folks that can get to it in New York. There's some great collections of that early Art Nouveau pots that, I mean, when I first walked past them, I was like, this can't be real. Like, is that ceramic? Like that was the feeling that I had. But I think what's nice about this process is that it's different enough that each company had a pretty different take on it, even though it's in the umbrella of iridescence.
Sure.
So is there anything else that you could provide for, say, a beginner potter that's interested in this type of glaze that would help them get over the fear of it? Because I do think there is maybe some fear of this process. So can you talk a little bit more about like how someone that's really new might approach this?
Yeah, and I mean, I think partially it's like a self-inflicted wound. That there is so much information about this process that's out there in the world that people just don't know about. And I think, I mean, in terms of kind of, allaying people's fears about it kind of goes back to what we were talking about. There really isn't much difference between this process and raku, which everybody is comfortable with. Anybody who, does ceramics at some point is going to do some raku firing. So it's really about thinking about it in terms of how it's kind of different from that. And I think if that's how you approach it, it's a lot less intimidating to kind of dip your feet in the water. And like I said, it's that reversal. You're introducing a combustible into the kiln rather than taking the ware out of the kiln and putting it into a combustible. Beyond that, yeah, there's some material differences. There's a little bit of temperature variation. But like any scientific process, and glaze is science, glaze is chemistry, glaze is physics, glaze is geology. It's about experimentation and giving yourself the freedom to fail and being okay with that, because like anything that we do, none of us sat down on a wheel for the first time and made anything pretty. It's a long process like anything else, but you can get there eventually. There's a ton of information out there. Anyone who's familiar, and if they're not familiar with the work of Greg Daly, they should be. Greg Daly is a master of this technique and other techniques that fall within the kind of gamut, the sort of encyclopedia of what we think of when we talk about luster. And he wrote a really fantastic book that's completely focused on the technology and the history as well of these different processes. So that's what I always recommend to people if they're looking to get into this, is get Greg Daly's book. I think it's 20 some bucks on Amazon. And it's a really fantastic primer if you're really kind of looking to dip your toes in the water of that. It can give you a good starting point.
Can you plug your social media and then also Pewabic, so if people want to see some of the glazes we're talking about, they can check them out?
Yeah, so my personal Instagram is just at Alex Thullen, Thullen. That's a lot of my personal research. So I'm working at high temperatures. I do a lot of iron-based effects and things. For the pottery, it's just at Pewabic on Instagram, Pewabic.
Well, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. It's good talking to you.
I'd like to thank Alex for coming on the show, and I certainly appreciate that he can explain lusters in such a simple way. If you'd like to buy some of the work that we talk about, including the tiles that are a part of Pewabic's regular production line, you can find all of that at pewabic.org. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That's Amico Brent, the Archie Bray Foundation, and the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor on the show, you can get in touch through our website. That's brickyardnetwork.org. Also wanted to mention that my friend Paul Blaze, who you guys are probably fans of his podcast, The Potter's Cast, is still in need of support. He's just had another surgery on his eye. He was injured in a wake surfing accident in the Columbia River about a month ago and has a long road to recovery. There's a GoFundMe that will help he and his wife over the next few months as he gets back on his feet. So if you'd like to donate, you can check that out at the link in the show notes. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.
This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.